The questions that have been laid out for us by Jill and by Aruna are really huge questions, absolutely daunting questions. I was quite flabbergasted. It might be a bit much to expect us to answer them all, but if we can explore some of them, then I think that's incredibly important. So it's very much in that spirit that these are provisional propositions that I'm offering about how we might think about networks in the study of cross-cultural modernity. So Vincent Meeson's 18-minute film entitled Vita Nova of 2009 enters the archive that surrounds the photograph of the cover of Paris Match, which Roland Barthes discussed in the conclusion of Mythologies of 1957. The image plays an important part in the claims being made for semiotics, although for most of Barthes' readers, we only got to see what he was describing, quote, a young Negro in a French uniform is saluting, end quote, when the photograph was repeated some 50 years later in Tony Godfrey's survey text on conceptual art of 1998. Starting out from the caption, Little Diouf from Ouagadougou, which you can see there. I think I have a pointer. Starting out from the caption, having completed a couple of projects in Burkina Faso in 2006, Meeson's research led him to Issa Kabore, who was one of the 3 boys trained at the same military academy who had traveled to France in 1955 to take part in a televised pageant that was held at the Palais de Sport de Paris, which was the subject of the magazine's story. Okay, and that's from the inside of the magazine. And we see Diouf and his colleagues in 1955. Kabore reports in the film that Diouf Birane was from Senegal and had been a doctor in Burkina Faso before he died in the 1980s. And in giving him a proper name, Isa acts as a witness whose living testimony allows a hitherto anonymous image to receive belated recognition and a proper name, even as Isa himself becomes a double or a surrogate for the absent one in the moment when the film shows him seeing his own image in the magazine from 1955 for the very first time. And I think it was at this moment that I realized I was crying. What touched me was a gesture of redemptive return, whereby archival material, instead of being buried in the past, flashes up into contemporaneity in a critical moment of awakening. To the extent that such gestures identify the archive as a critical site of investigation in contemporary art, what distinguishes post-colonial and diasporic practices is a sense of an imaginative homecoming belatedly received by images of subjects who would otherwise remain lost to history. Now, the past can never be truly redeemed in the sense of being made fully present again, but in the act of giving a second life or a new life, vita nova, to photographs of the anonymous and the unknown, the relationship that's being constellated between past and present seems best illuminated by what Walter Benjamin rehearsed in the Arcades project as, quote, an experiment in the technique of awakening, an attempt to become aware of the dialectical, the Copernican turn of remembrance. And drawing on fragments such as these, I want to ask what art history's future might look like if it were to be modeled on the fractured temporality of diaspora, in which traumatic dispossession and repeated uprootings are nonetheless accompanied by surprising moments of unexpected return. If the technique of awakening offers one way of writing art history in the wake of the global turn, does this imply a future of permanent hauntology? For, like a mourner who participates in the funeral ritual of a wake, the diasporic sense of homecoming may well take place at the graveside location that Eurocentric ideologies have seemed reluctant to want to leave. Meeson's film is part of a body of work that revisits the archive, not to resurrect or restore the past the way it really was, but to lay before us the temporal qualities of belatedness, deferral, and delay, by which archival material becomes legible, readable, intelligible, and valuable for the first time, only after a lengthy period of latency. Film-based works by Isaac Julian and Black Audio Film Collective, like photo-based works by Lorna Simpson, this is Photo Booth of 2008, or A Feast of Scraps by Glenn Ligon, or Santu Mofokeng's The Black Photo Album of 1997, each put forward acts of redemptive return that produce potent affect in the spectator by virtue of the way in which absence and presence are figured together to engender the disturbing, but not altogether unpleasurable, feeling of being ghosted. So Issa Kabore's belated encounter with his own image in the Paris Match photo spread parallels our own delayed recognition of Diouf Birain. And in this relay of identification, Birain returns to us as a friendly ghost. But when the narrator of Vita Nova says, quote, "It's him, the grandchild, secretly haunted by the ghost of his grandfather," end quote, as we are shown a photograph of Roland Barthes at the 1936 funeral of his maternal grandfather, Louis-Gustave Binger, the film also brings another kind of ghost out of the archive. Binger was a founding figure in establishing Côte d'Ivoire as a French colony in the 1880s, and even had a town named after him, Bingerville, as well as his own dedicated museum. Although in autobiographical writings such as Bart by Bart of 1997, one would find absolutely no trace of the colonial roots of Bart's family, whose intimacies are otherwise so meticulously examined. And secrecy seems to be a key word. Was it shame that kept certain family members locked in the colonial closet, thereby blocking their entry into conscious remembrance? To observe the absent presence of the figure of his daughter, Henrietta Binger, in Camera Lucida of 1980, whose image remains unseen throughout the text, precisely because it is held sacred to her memory on the part of the grieving survivor who writes, is to be aware that one is witnessing in this book the return of the repressed in a text that's so richly populated with photographs of blacks, in works by Richard Avedon, James Van der Zee, and Nadar's 1882 portrait of Savornin de Brazza. In a passage adumbrating Barthes' distinction between studium, the background element that attracts and holds our interest in a picture, and punctum, the piercing affect that cuts into one's subjectivity with unbidden or involuntary force, the author's own identification with one of the black boys, and you remember, it's this one, it's the one with the folded arms, overshadows any inquiry into de Brazza's colonial identity as a Franco-Italian explorer of the Congo, after whom the city of Congo-Brazzaville was named. So redemption is one of those pharmacon-like words, pulling us in antinomial directions, for it summons both the messianic, to save, to rescue, and the mercantile, to exchange, to buy back. But what I set out to examine in the phenomenon of redemptive return is precisely the constellation of past and present that haunts photography and its ghostly intimacies with our experiences of time, not on account of its medium specificity, its medium-specific properties, but in terms of the agency that is imparted to the image as a non-human actor in its own right. Now, although this formulation from actor network theory may sound anomalous, the idea that images have lives of their own, which after all is a view that art historians share in common with animists, allows a way out, perhaps allows us a way out of subject-object ontologies when we address the two sides of the photographic image as something that is both a documentary bearer of evidentiary truth, while also being a phantasmatic surface laden with affect, especially emotions associated with loss, remembrance, and mourning. And keeping both aspects in view, one might say the alloy of the messianic and the mercantile in Benjamin's thinking is eminently suited to art history and visual studies in diasporic contexts where ancient pasts and prophetic futures combine in chronotopes that are fundamentally at odds with the interpretation of history as progress, evolution, development. So, dialectical awakening calls us to the slow and patient unraveling of cross-cultural entanglements. And yet, it seems that it's precisely this unfinishedness, which is so important to Benjamin's philosophy of history, that gets counteracted today by the pressures of a presentism that is driven by an ethos of what might be called administered redemption. The wish to perceive the present as a privileged terminus in which closure upon violent histories of inequality is finally achieved by putting the past behind us merely perpetuates the linearity of a simplistic before and after model. In the 20 years or so during which art history has slowly come to terms with the globalization theory since the 1980s, one observes the trade-off between categories of time and space, whereby the geographical expansiveness that becomes ever more inclusive of national, ethnic, and cultural identities does indeed broaden the horizontal axis of coverage within the field, although the vertical axis of temporality most often remains a Western prerogative, when the dichotomous differentiation that separates West and non-West, and it seems symptomatic that these terms have returned today, the dichotomy that separates West and non-West, which is a binary reproduced as a disciplinary norm across academic curricula and museum collections, distributes the non-West, so-called, either into the realm of pure timelessness that has little need of periodization, or else into a perpetual present that has no historical depth. So is the commonplace classification of ancient, classical, and modern as much a product of art history's disciplinary Westernism in its monopolistic naming of time, as much part of that as the localism of its preferred geographies? Cultural studies has offered a historicized account of globalization, not as something that begins in Maastricht in 1992, but which is a world-making process fully underway since 1492. In which case, against the grain of the global contemporary, is there an argument to be made that rather than 20th century modernisms, the key subject areas most in need of cross-cultural attention are precisely those associated with post-Renaissance periods in the West? In place of answers, Benjamin's approach calls for a wakefulness that worries the grounds upon which these questions are laid out. And in this respect, the diasporic scene of homecoming, brought about when scattered archival photographs find a place of rest in contemporary art, does not warrant celebratory affirmation as an act of inclusion that redeems past neglect, so much as it encourages us instead to appreciate the porous networks through which photographic images travel back and forth through time. So the constellation of past and present that activates something uncanny in photographic practices which employ historical materials, and Okwe Nwiza's exhibition Archive Fever at the International Centre of Photography in 2005 is a good example of that, is writ large in the late 20th century rediscovery of African and South Asian studio portraiture traditions. This process has resulted in such large-scale survey exhibitions as Insight, African Photographers from 1940 to the Present, that was curated by Nwiza and others at the Guggenheim in 1996, Africa by Herself, 1998, at the European House of Photography in Paris, that was curated by the Revue Noire editorial team, including Simon and Jami, that resulted in the Anthology of African and Indian Ocean Photography of 1999, and more recently, in a way which I think highlights the temporality of belatedness, where Three Dreams Cross, 150 years of photography from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, that was exhibited in 2010 at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, that had been initiated and co-curated by the British Asian photographer Sunil Gupta. So to say that what makes our encounter with such material post-colonial is not its manifest content, but rather the belatedness by which it returns to us as culturally and artistically significant after a period of lying dormant in the archive for many years, is to anticipate that the knowledge produced by such research over the last 15 years or so has the capacity to rewrite photography's entire 150-year history as a whole. It's not just that our received narratives make generalizations based on Western archives alone, but that it is photography, perhaps more so than painting, printmaking, or any other picture-making technology, that reveals to us the cross-cultural conditions of global modernity by showing us how global subjects appropriated the camera to depict their own experiences in different parts of the world. As a product of 19th century industrial civilization in Europe, the principle of photomechanical reproducibility had far-reaching consequences that went far beyond the medium's technical properties alone. For as the apparatus begins to enter a world from the 1840s onwards, where some societies still owned slaves and in which some cultures had yet to be colonized, photography discloses its formative role in visual codifications of race. The study of anthropometric photography, with its relationship to articulations of power and knowledge in disciplinary practices of classification in the discourses of anthropology and criminology, by now firmly established as a field of inquiry, reveals to us that photography played a central role in fixing the image of the colonized, the enslaved, and the indigenous as other to the West. But to acknowledge so is to say that as yet we have only half of the story. Where the Francophone research in particular sets forth materials from Africa from the 1880s onwards, it does not just show us how Africans saw themselves when photographer and photographed shared mutual control over the apparatus of representation, thereby undermining the harsh subject-object polarity of looking and being looked at under the sights of the colonial gaze. But it also shows to us the 1890s to circa 1910 period as a shared timeline during which the social conditions of modernity were globalized and thence universalized. So what we have, instead of a linear sequence in which photography first serves the interests of colonial domination and then subsequently acts as a tool of self-representation amongst the colonized, which was a view taken in early phases of post-colonial theory, where the so-called other talks back, what we have instead is the challenge to conceptualize the transcultural simultaneity by which photographs were put to agonistic uses from the very outset. In the African-American context, Sean Michelle Phillips's research on the photographic portraits collected by W.E.B. Du Bois for the American Negro exhibit that was held in 1900 at the Universal Exposition in Paris opens up the Black Atlantic networks in which world fairs, trade fairs, and industrial exhibitions provided a platform for discourses of black internationalism. But she also indicates the emergent reverse discourse by which codes and conventions that had been associated with eugenic classification, such as the frontal and profile views shown in one pictorial frame, came to be re-signified in new Negro self-representations that subverted visual othering, not by repudiating the process of typification, but by employing similitude to contest dominant discourses of racialization. But as scholars and curators enter the archive, are they rediscovering or repositioning the materials they find? Whereas the former, rediscovering, gives us a naturalistic account in which the identity, meaning, and value of the photographic image is regarded as an intrinsic property, the latter, repositioning, implies a constructionist explanation in which contingent relations among authors, texts, and readers play the principal role in forming the networks and circuits through which photographic meanings are produced. The key issue here, which entails a return to the insights which the translation of Benjamin's 1934 essay on photomechanical reproduction brought to the shift from modernist to postmodernist paradigms of interpretation, really concerns how we think about decontextualization. From the very beginning, photography has had a multiplicity of applications, for it was used on account of its evidentiary value in medicine, in law, across the natural and human sciences, from astronomy to zoology, as well as in governmental practices of urban planning, military reconnaissance, to name a few. and the print cultures of newspapers, magazines, and advertising. So using photographs to produce art to be displayed on gallery walls was not just one application amongst many, but the very multiplicity of its uses deprived photography of a medium-specific identity. While derided as a pious medium that embodied the antithesis of originality, the circulatory mobility acquired by the photographic image by virtue of reproducibility correlatively entailed that any image could be uprooted from its origins by the process of de- and recontextualization. So as photographs travel and migrate far and away from the intentions and purposes for which they were initially made, altered meanings and values are thereby accrued by formally identical images that are discursively pushed and pulled across different institutional spaces. I'm doing nothing more than summarizing the insights of photographic studies since the translation of Benjamin's text in the 1970s, but to what extent have those insights been brought to bear on our understanding of the colonial archive? That's the question I'm raising. As it relates to post-colonial returns of 20th century African studio portraiture, the paradox is twofold. The driving tendency towards author-centered readings from the Insight exhibition onwards has actually relied on an anachronistic strategy of modernist auteurism, which allows African photographic practitioners entry into the institutional spaces of the modern art museum, but without acknowledging the repositioning process itself in a self-reflexive manner. Conversely, reader-centered approaches to archival material, and I'm thinking here of an anthology such as Picturing Us, African-American Identity in Photography, edited by Deborah Willis in 1995, tends, on the other hand, to conflate photography's evidentiary and indexical value with the phantasmatic allure acquired by images that induce a melancholic form of over-identification. And this reader-centered approach also tends to neglect the exhibitionary space of the gallery or the museum as a distinctive institutional site in which the aesthetic qualities of photographs are thrown into relief by their journeys of decontextualization that grant reproducible images a second life or an afterlife. So, standing in a New York or Paris gallery and viewing a portrait of a Malian sitter that was posed in a Bamako studio sometime in the 1950s, I may be implicitly aware of the process that has translated a photograph which originated in one context, perhaps to be sent to family or friends for private display in the home or in a photograph album, but which has now been repositioned as an art object to be viewed as an autonomous work in its own right. But without curatorial strategies that acknowledge the act of translation, the process, the contingency of repositioning, for example, by showing vintage prints in a vitrine alongside freshly minted exhibition prints, this was a strategy of the curators in Autograph for a 2010 exhibition of the works by Ghanaian photographer James Barner. Without such self-reflexive devices in exhibition practice, it is not just that the network of photographic circulation is hidden by the naturalization of the process of de- and recontextualization, but that the identification of an author function, seducator in this case, actually obscures from view the multiple cast of actors, gallerists, dealers, curators, archivists, and spectators, who are all participants in the network of photographic meaning. To observe that the aesthetic aura surrounding Seducator's Bamako portraits generates a qualitative difference from photographic depictions of Africans that had been historically produced by Westerners is to point to the iconographic agency of distinctive stylistic tropes, clothing, posture, the fabric backgrounds, and various props that have been brought into play between photographer and photographed in the intersubjective staging of an Afro-modern selfhood. But to argue, as Olu Ogbuebi has done and others continue to do, that such signifying differences were the product of authorial intentions to counteract colonial representation is to rely less on the evidence of a practitioner's self-understanding as an entrepreneur and to push instead the issue of agency into the discursive space of the museum collection that requires an author name in order to secure the recognition of aesthetic worth, just as art market transactions require authorial signature to verify originality and authenticity as the basis of exchangeability. So none of these issues are new. For in 1982, Rosalind Krauss questioned what was at stake when archival material came to be repositioned as art by asking, this is with regards to a MoMA exhibit of photographs by Timothy O'Sullivan that had been produced in the 1860s, 1870s as part of a geological survey of Arizona and the western states. So at this point in 1982, Krauss is asking, did O'Sullivan, in his own day, construct his work for the aesthetic discourse and the space of the exhibition, or did he create it for the scientific topographical discourse? Is the interpretation of O'Sullivan's work as a representation of aesthetic values not a retrospective construction designed to secure it as art? And is this projection not illegitimate, the composition of a false history? But perhaps rather than true or false, the attentions that art historians such as John Tagg or practitioners such as Victor Bergin gave to photographic polysemy led instead to a heightened awareness of the circulatory sociability of the photographic image as the locus of a politics as much as an ethics of interpretation. But to what extent has a space for self-reflection on these issues been pushed out of post-colonial and diasporic frames of investigation by institutional drivers of administered redemption? Far from being an either-or issue in which a seducator is or is not an authorial subject, the issue concerns instead the way in which the affirmative emphasis on inclusion, by which photography brings evidence of Afro-modernity into the debate on globalizing art history, nonetheless obscures the transactional interests amongst multiple actors by virtue of the auteurist method of interpretation. So at a mercantile level, all actors are participating in a win-win situation. Everyone benefits, which works very well in terms of a neoliberal scenario, but in terms of the criticality by which we're understanding this process, is it the case that the marketability of African studio photography has somehow come to inhibit these questions for further inquiry and debate? Indeed, when Seda Keita's photographs were first exhibited in the West in Africa Explores in 1991, and this is a page from the exhibition catalogue, captions stating "photographer unknown" ask us to reflect on problems of attribution that precisely disclose contingencies in the constructed character of the author function, precisely because the author function hadn't then been constructed, which in turn raises the issue of whether authorship is distributed among several actors rather than exclusively identified with the individuating effects it generates in institutional discourses. Relatedly, how might we separate in the analysis of redemptive return the conflation that so often arises between decontextualization and commodification? Alan Sekula reflects in his 1983 text, again part of the sort of canonical scholarship on thinking the archive from over, 30 years ago now. Alan Sekula reflects that, quote, not only are pictures in archives literally for sale, but their meanings are up for grabs. In an archive, the possibility of meaning is liberated from the actual contingencies of use. But this liberation is a loss, an abstraction from the complexities and richness of use, a loss of context. If I go back a step, I might say that while beholding one of Seydou Keita's portraits, I realize I can know nothing of the identity of the African woman who posed for the camera, for her name, her story, much less her identity, are unknowable, they're lost. They're irretrievably lost to history. And this element of unknowability is at odds with claims for photography's evidentiary truth. Although, as I am attracted and drawn into the space of this anonymity, it is the transsubjective network of relayed identifications that warrants investigation into the photograph's phantasmatic and affective status. Without factual or verifiable knowledge of the referent, the viewer is in a position that is not unlike European modernists who are drawn towards tribal artifacts about which they knew absolutely nothing, which, in the course of their journey of decontextualization, were evaluated in aestheticist terms, purely as morphological datum. But in the case of diasporic spectators, should we not say that this lack of knowledge, this loss of context that Sekula is evoking, comes to be flooded with affect by virtue of the way in which the image gets to be reinscribed into commemorative chains of iteration and substitution, in which the loss that Sekula evokes also triggers an affective turn of remembrance that pivots precisely upon the unknowability of a diaspora's lost and unknowable ancestors. So whether such diasporic forms of spectatorship arise from equal parts of melancholic identification or narcissistic projection, it's salutary, I think, to note that while Benjamin saw photography destroying aura in 1934, in his 1931 essay on the brief history of photography, he used the term aura in a very different way, and in a way that's strikingly similar to punctum. For in describing an unknowable face that he encounters in an anonymous 19th century daguerreotype, Benjamin writes, quote, "There remains something that goes beyond testimony to the photographer's art, something that cannot be silenced, that fills you with an unruly desire to know what her name was, the woman who was alive there, who even now is still real and will never consent to be wholly absorbed in art." I think that's so fitting. So in addition to the dynamics of involuntary memory and the ethics of remembrance as features common to Benjamin and Barth that are relevant to our understanding of the seductive appeal exerted by recontextualized African studio photographs, we should also note that the cultural studies method of interpretation put forward in the 1970s by Stuart Hall also turns around anonymous images that are authorless, in a sense that have to be authorless. Although cultural studies was not particularly interested in medium specificity, its semiotic account of denotation and connotation, along with the fixative role of the linguistic caption in closing down photographic polysemy, undermined the truth, non-truth dichotomy, which we heard from Rosalind Krauss, that had anchored the liberal humanist values of realism in reportage traditions across both author-named documentary photography and also in mass circulation magazines like Picture Post or Paris Match. By attending to the impersonal codes that networked sender, message, and receiver within anonymous and authorless imagery in mass culture, which was excluded from high culture institutions of art by default, Hall approached the circuitry of authors, texts, and readers with a focus on the latter axis between text and readers, thereby focusing on how audiences generate conflicting readings of one and the same text, in a way that undermined the privilege given to the former axis of author text in modernist criticism, where meaning was regarded as a fixed content deposited into the text by intentionality. In short, by showing that images without authors could generate meaning and value by themselves, cultural studies revealed the agency of the photographic image as a semiotic actor in its own right. Furthermore, it was photography, rather than any other representational medium, that enabled cultural studies to show that meaning is not in the text, but is that which circulates in our relationship to the text. And in this way, the attention given to formal relations of representation in the modernist episteme was displaced by the attention now given to the social relations of representation. So when Hall's 1984 essay was published in 10/8 on representations of black immigrants to Britain, thus contrasts the problem-oriented documentary photographs of Picture Post, which we can see on one hand side, to studio portraits that were produced by Ernest Dyke in Birmingham in the 1950s and 60s. What he's doing is identifying the signifying difference generated by two distinct practices of photography, rather than giving us an auteurist account based on the photographer's cultural or ethnic or national identity. Hall's materials speak directly to the differential aura surrounding the African photographic archive, and his view that, quote, there is no such unitary thing as photography, only a diversity of practices and historical situations in which the photographic text is produced, circulated, and deployed, gives us, in my view, a more flexible research model than auteurism for understanding the networks through which photographs themselves travel in a diaspora-like condition of being contextualized from their origins as they migrate and disperse across multiple discursive spaces. But the one institution that was missing from Stuart Hall's 1984 account, from the cultural studies account more generally, was the institution of art. Such omission matters because, unlike all the other institutions that photographs move through, the art institution is differentiated by the degree of autonomy that withdraws materials from the practical realm of usage and exchangeability so that they can be considered as foci for disinterested looking. And I think it's precisely this aspect of disinterestedness that underscores the beneficial role of the museum in the recovery of Afro-modernity's photographic archive. And yet the question is whether our ability to model the broader study of Afro-modernism on what photographic histories of dispersal and return are showing us about the networks of meaning remains, I think, inhibited by the lingering ghosts of medium specificity as much as by the undead foundationalism in which the dichotomy of the original and the copy lay at the very heart of the old modernist mindset. We thought we had slain the beast, but it keeps coming back. To say the repositioning process reveals that photographs have a diasporic life of their own, for all reproducible images are orphanistas. This is a term that the social historian Tina Kampt has used in her account of Afro-German family photographic archives. That all reproducible images are orphanistas, vulnerable to being separated from parental belonging, is to say that the homecoming provided by exhibition spaces in the institutions of contemporary art gives such images a second life or even an afterlife, in the sense that Benjamin's thoughts on translation led him to the view that the afterlife of original text, quote, would not be called that if it were not a transformation and a renewal of something living, end quote. But what if, instead of celebrating these welcome returns from the past as a fulfillment of imaginary plenitude or a compensatory act of inclusion, what if the process was read in reverse? In other words, in light of photography's intimacy with histories of colonialism and slavery, can we say that if painting is to photography as original is to copy, is there not also a corollary in which the former plays the role of the master, in relation to which the latter must be the servant? It was not just that the two sides of the photographic image were held apart by the ontological separation of object-centered and subject-centered discourses within the modernist worldview that was regulated by medium specificity on the one hand and by authorial originality on the other, but that the history of such polarized conceptions continues to haunt our understanding, or our not yet understanding, of the dialogical relations through which Afro-modern artists position themselves in relation to the Western art historical canon. Whereas the grounds upon which documentary realism asserted photography's evidentiary truth were the grounds upon which the Modern Art Museum historically rejected it as a copyist's medium, the pictorialist's plea for admission, which is replete with auteurist legitimation, put photographs in the place of a colonial mimic, perceived as an untrustworthy actor who performs illusion and deception. I'm thinking of the pictorialist discourse as one of colonial mimicry, in which the photograph is requesting inclusion, legitimation in the museum. Accept me for what I am not. Accept me insofar as I resemble a painting. While conversely, instrumentalist views of photography as a mechanical means to an end went about judging the value of photography's capacity to record appearances in terms of a servile fidelity to the duty of depiction, in which such faithfulness was a virtue only insofar as it confirmed the heteronomy of the photomechanical apparatus. And if we think about the way in which conceptual artists used photographs as late as the 70s, this idea of an instrumental view of a faithful record of an ephemeral event is reproduced widely. To say that such double binds were not dislodged until cultural studies and conceptual art converged to problematize the status of the photographic image, which informs the scene of Benjamin's translation, is to notice, as John Roberts does, that, quote, photography was the means by which conceptual art's exit from modernist closure was realizable as practice. Yet photography itself was of little interest to conceptual artists, producing a situation in which critical agency was given to the photographic image without photography becoming theoretically self-conscious as a medium. So where the use of photography by Romer Bearden in the African-American context has been insightfully addressed by Sarah Cannell in terms of an autodidactic studio practice of emulative copying. What we're looking at here is the photostat machine that was part of Bearden's studio practice in the 40s and 50s, as well as one of the reverse plate negatives, in this case of photographs of African masks, that he produced as a result of this process, and then the photograph of Malraux that distills the Museum Without Walls thesis. So Cannell insightfully addresses the use of photography, but does so in terms of reading it as an autodidactic practice of emulative copying. But what might a Benjaminian perspective bring to the dialogic positioning by which such a 20th century Afro-modern artist positioned himself with respect to the diverse images made available by photography to the Museum Without Walls? Employing a reverse plate photostat enlarger in the 1950s, Bearden examined compositional strategies by eliminating color to play with pictorial properties of flatness. Quote, I did that with Giotto, Duccio, Veronese, Rembrandt, right on up to Monet. I spent 3 years copying, end quote. But the artist also indicated the cross-cultural reach of his chosen sources when he stated in 1967, talking about his relationship to photographic images in his collages, that he related to them, quote, not through any one particular incident, but through art. Zurburan, African sculpture, Bosch, Jan Steen, Chinese calligraphy, Mondrian. As Malraux says, art is made from art. I cannot deny that there is something transactional in these works, end quote. Although Cannell draws out transcultural affinities and distances in Bearden's dialogical intertextuality, the sense in which his statement disrupts the either-or logic of the original as master and the copy as mere servant is somewhat overlooked by the one-sided emphasis on his Western sources alone, which leads to an account of a black artist's self-positioning as a, quote, legitimate legatee of that tradition, but which also tends to underplay the translational rather than emulative force of repetition and difference in the antiphony of Bearden's core and response. Moreover, as the co-author with Carl Holte of The Painter's Mind, a study of the relations of structure and space in painting, which was published in 1969, Bearden's intellectual engagement with André Malraux and the Museum Without Walls thesis, his understanding of art that is made from art, is fully of a piece with the self-consciously diasporic manner in which collages such as Pittsburgh Memory of 1964 quote photo fragments of tribal sculpture to assemble the composition of faces, thus referring not to Africa as a real-world entity, as it actually is, but to an imagined Africa that is always already thrust into quotation marks by diasporic journeys of decontextualization. To notice how the photostat apparatus itself returns in 1964, when fellow Spiral Group member Reginald Gammon suggests to Bearden that he enlarge 8 by 12-inch papier-collé into 5 by 6-foot works that resemble nothing so much as history paintings, is to observe that temporalities of repetition and return in Afro-modernism play a generative role that falls below the radar of the teleological model. Working in the fold between evidentiary truth and working in the fold between evidentiary truths and affects associated with remembrance, the allure of unknowable fragments recovered from the archive is overlaid with an ethical injunction that Santu Mofokeng pinpoints in the subtitle to his Black Photo album that says, "Look at me," which I think echoes very strongly Benjamin's account of the command he encounters in the face of anonymous 19th century photographs, "Remember me." And is it not this demand to convert those who might be lost and forgotten into those who can be memorialized that gives an element of hopefulness to the afterlife of the image that comes back through the repetitions of redemptive return? Jean-Michel Basquiat commissioned his portrait from James Van der Zee, who was then in his late 80s, for mercantile purposes of publicity when the artist needed an image to go with an article for Andy Warhol's Interview magazine. But in the ghostly revenance, the ghostly repetition by which Basquiat repeats the pose of the barefoot prophet, the affect that is imparted to the studio props, the Baroque splendor of the mahogany chair, the trompe-l'oeil painted backdrop, evokes a temporal continuum in which the postmodern artist, instead of being orphaned in neo-primitivism, is being imaginatively reparented by diasporic ancestors whose first life took place during the Harlem Renaissance, which itself is a nomenclature that entails a kind of counter-mimetic doubling of one of Western art history's most cherished periods and foundational categories. So Harlem Renaissance is a form of doubling or counter-copying, if you will, but not as copy as to original, but as in the act of translation from one cultural context to another. The contemporary South Asian artist Vivan Sundaram dwells in the archive as a place where the post-colonial artist, like the reader of a Gothic novel, is someone who wants to be haunted. The artist is grandchild of Umrao Singh Shergill, an aristocrat whose land was confiscated by the British and who then became a recluse, conducting science experiments and printing photographic self-portraits in his darkroom that showed him performing as a yogi, as a sage, as a prophet. When Sundaram adds his aunt, who is the mid-20th century artist Amrita Shergill, into his photographs, he welcomes into his practice transgenerational haunting by virtue of figuring photo ghosts who witness both the family romance inscribed within the artist's genealogy, but also the rewriting of modernism in India. In handling such archival elements with tenderness and care, works such as these, like those by Ligon and Simpson, do not replace the external truths of documentary realism with the inner truths of confessional subjectivity, so much as they lay bare photography's ability to traverse spatial boundaries of public and private, as well as temporal categories of past and present. So diaspora is a place where photography's global archives return not once, but twice. At any point in the 20th century, the anthropometric photographs taken by M.V. Portman in India during the 1850s could have been found just waiting in the dark. But the lateness of the discovery that took place in the 1980s, after photographic studies had overturned the modernist mindset of the original and the copy, indicates that we had not yet been ready to receive what the past was transmitting to us. In the act of return, whereby Pushpamela N. works through the colonial archive, it is the black and white checkerboard pattern of the plastic lino flooring that repeats across so much African studio photography that attracts my attention, kind of punctum in its own right. It may turn out to be a purely superficial coincidence that it returns in portraiture by Malik Sidibe in Mali and Samuel Fosso in the Central African Republic, although it may also be a ghostly trace of an agency that is neither in the subject nor in the object, but in the circulatory relationship by which identities are worlded and come to be cross-culturally entangled. So in his view that modernity resembles a traumatic accident that has befallen tradition, resulting in a crisis of transmission, Benjamin apprehends the belatedness or latency that for him is a feature of historicity per se. The idea is that the significance of events is unavailable to consciousness in the moment of their occurrence because we are too close to them. And yet, if their significance only arrives through the deferred action of Nachtraglichkeit, then this would imply that one is never fully present to one's own history, that one is never fully present to oneself, that, as one Benjamin scholar puts it, quote, modernity names the moment when the thinking subject can no longer be said to be completely in control or conscious of the actual events that necessarily comprise his past, end quote. To suggest, as Jean Fisher does, that black diasporic visual arts call for an interpretative correlation between something non-human in the force of involuntary memory that repeats the trauma of cultural dispossession and an orientation towards futurity whose prophetic or redemptive emphasis is acquired in proportion to the scale of the inaugural catastrophe, is to suggest perhaps that photography's wandering temporalities may yet provide art history with a viable model of future research.